entrance to Gryffindor Tower, which was concealed behind a large portrait of a fat lady in a pink silk dress. "Password?" she said, as they approached. "Balderdash," said George. "A prefect downstairs told me." The portrait swung forward to reveal a hole in the wall, through which they all climbed. A crackling fire was warming the circular common room, which was full of squashy armchairs and tables. Hermione cast the merrily dancing flames a dark look, and Harry distinctly heard her mutter, "Slave labour," before bidding them good night and disappearing through the doorway to the girls' dormitories. Harry, Ron, and Neville climbed up the last spiral staircase until they reached their own dormitory, which was situated at the top of the tower. 5 four-poster beds with deep crimson hangings stood against the walls, each with the owner's trunk at the foot. Dean and Seamus were already getting into bed. Seamus had pinned his Ireland rosette to his headboard, and Dean had tacked up a poster of Victor Crumb over his bedside table. His old poster of West Ham football team was pinned right next to it. "Mental," sighed Ron, shaking his head at the completely stationary soccer players. Harry, Ron, and Neville got into their pajamas and into bed. Someone, a house elf no doubt, had placed warming pans beneath the sheets. It was extremely comfortable, lying there in bed and listening to the storm raging outside. "I might go in for it, you know," Ron said sleepily through the darkness. "If Fred and George find out how to the tournament, you never know, do you?" "Suppose not." Harry rolled over in his bed. A series of dazzling new pictures formed in his mind's eye. He had hoodwinked the impartial judge into believing he was 17. He had become Hogwarts champion. He was standing on the grounds, his arms raised in triumph in front of the whole school, all of whom were applauding and screaming. He had just won the Triwizarding tournament. Cho's face stood out particularly clearly in the blurred crowd, her face glowing with admiration. Harry grinned into his pillow, exceptionally glad that Ron couldn't see what he could. Chapter 13. Mad-Eye Moody. The storm had blown itself out by the following morning. Though the ceiling in the great hall was still gloomy, heavy clouds of pewter gray swirled overhead as Harry, Ron, and Hermione examined their new times table at breakfast. A few seats along, Fred, George, and Lee Jordan were discussing magical methods of aging themselves and bluffing their way into the Triwizarding tournament. "Today's not bad, outside all morning," said Ron, who was running his finger down his times table. "Herbology with the Hufflepuffs, care of magical creatures, darn it, we're still with the Slytherins. Double divination this afternoon," Harry groaned, looking down. Divination was his least favorite subject, apart from potions. Professor Trelawney kept predicting Harry's death, which he found extremely annoying. "You should have given it up like me, shouldn't you?" said Hermione briskly, buttering herself some toast. "Then you'd be doing something sensible like arithmetic." "You're eating again, I noticed," said Ron, watching Hermione add liberal amounts of jam to her buttered toast. "I've decided there are better ways of making a stand about elf rights," said Hermione haughtily. "Yah, and you were hungry," said Ron, grinning. There was a sudden rustling noise above them, and a hundred owls came soaring through the open windows, carrying the morning mail. Instinctively, Harry looked up, but there was no sign of white among the mass of brown and gray. The owls circled the tables, looking for the people for whom their letters and packages were addressed. A large tawny owl soared down to Neville Longbottom and deposited a parcel in his lap. Neville almost always forgot to pack something. On the other side of the hall, Draco Malfoy's eagle owl had landed on his shoulder, carrying what looked like an unusual supply of sweets and cakes from home. Trying to ignore the sinking feeling of disappointment in his stomach, Harry returned to his porridge. Was it possible that something had happened to Hedwig and that Sirius hadn't even got his letter? His preoccupation lasted all the way across the sodden vegetable path until they arrived at the greenhouse in Greenhouse 3, but here he was distracted by Professor Sprout showing the class the ugliest plants Harry had ever seen. Indeed, they looked less like plants than thick black giant slugs protruding vertically out of the soil. Each was squirming slightly and had a number of large shiny swellings upon it, which appeared to be full of liquid. Boobatubas, Professor Sprout told them briskly. They need squeezing. You will collect the pus. The what? Seamus Finnegan sounded revolted. Pus, Finnegan, pus, said Professor Sprout, and it's extremely valuable, so don't waste it. You will collect the pus, I say, in these bottles. Wear your dragonhide gloves. It can do funny things to the skin when undiluted. Pus. Squeezing the bubber tubbers was disgusting, but oddly satisfying. As each swelling was popped, a large amount of thick yellowish green liquid burst forth, which smelled strongly of petrol. They caught it in the bottles as Professor Sprout had indicated, and had by the end of the lesson had collected several pints. This'll keep the Madame Pomfrey happy, said Professor Sprout, stopping the last bottle with the cork. An excellent remedy for the more stubborn forms of acne, pus, should stop students resorting to desperate measures to rid themselves of pimples. Like poor Eloise Midgen, said Hannah Abbott of Pufflepuff in a hushed voice. She tried to curse hers off. Silly girl, said Professor Sprout, shaking her head. But Madame Pomfrey fixed her nose back on in the end. A booming bell echoed from the castle across the wet grounds, signaling the end of the lesson, and the class separated. The Hufflepuffs climbed the stone steps for Transfiguration, and Gryffindors headed in the other direction, down the sloping lawn towards Hagrid's small wooden cabin, which stood on the edge of the Forbidden Forest. Hagrid was standing outside his hut, one hand on the collar of his enormous black boarhound, Fang. There were several open wooden crates on the ground at his feet, and Fang was whimpering and straining at his collar, apparently keen to investigate the contents from more closely. As they drew nearer, an odd rattling noise reached their ears, punctuated by what sounded like minor explosions. "Morning," Hagrid said, grinning at Harry, Ron, and Hermione. "But a wait for the Slytherins. They won't want to miss this. Blasted scroots." "Come again," said Ron. Hagrid pointed down in the crates. "Ugh," squealed Lavender Brown, jumping backwards. "Ugh." Just about summed up the blast-ended scroots, in Harry's opinion. They looked like deformed, shell-less lobsters, horribly pale and slimy-looking, with legs sticking out in very odd places, and no visible heads.